Mom-to-be feels overwhelming movement. Doctors realize she's carrying 9 babies. What's worse, she's a single mother. How does her life change? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sterile air of the ultrasound room felt suffocating. Emily Jenkins lay on the examination table, her palms clammy, gripping the edge of the sheet that covered her abdomen. The steady hum of the ultrasound machine filled the room, broken only by the gentle voice of the technician trying to reassure her. "All right, Emily, let's take a look," the technician said, applying a generous amount of gel onto Emily's slightly rounded belly. She flinched at the cold sensation but stayed silent, her heart pounding against her ribcage. This wasn't her first ultrasound, but something about this one felt different. The technician moved the transducer across her skin, her brow furrowing almost immediately. Emily's stomach churned with unease as she caught the subtle shift in the woman's expression. "Is everything okay?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. The technician hesitated, her eyes darting toward the monitor. "I'm going to bring in the doctor," she said, forcing a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just sit tight for a moment." Emily's heart sank. Her grip on the sheet tightened as the technician left the room. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint echo of voices from the hallway. What could be wrong? Was the baby okay? Minutes felt like hours before the door opened, and Dr. Lucas Hayes walked in. He was calm and composed, his kind eyes offering a small measure of comfort as he took a seat beside her. "Emily," he began, his voice steady but serious, "there's something unusual about your ultrasound results. I'd like to take a closer look myself." She nodded, unable to speak. The cold gel was reapplied, and Dr. Hayes took over the transducer, his focus entirely on the screen. Emily's gaze flicked between his face and the monitor, but she couldn't make sense of the black and white blobs. Then he spoke. "Emily, you're not carrying one baby." Her breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Dr. Hayes exhaled slowly, his tone gentle but firm. "You're carrying 9. For a moment, the room spun. Emily's vision blurred, and she gripped the sides of the table to steady herself. 9? She whispered, as if saying it louder might make it more real. "How is that even possible?" "It's extremely rare," he admitted. "Non-euplets are almost unheard of. This will be a high-risk pregnancy and you'll need constant monitoring." Emily's mind raced. 9 babies? How would she manage? She was already struggling as a single mother-to-be, with her boyfriend Ryan having walked out the moment she told him she was pregnant. And now this? Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at Dr. Hayes. "What are my options?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Dr. Hayes hesitated. "We'll discuss everything in detail, but for now, the focus is on ensuring the health and safety of both you and the babies. This will be a challenging journey, Emily, but you're not alone. We'll take this one step at a time." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they only heightened the weight pressing on her chest. She nodded, too overwhelmed to respond, as he handed her a tissue to wipe the gel from her abdomen. As she left the clinic, clutching the ultrasound images tightly, the reality of her situation began to sink in. 9 lives were depending on her. How could she possibly do this alone? Over the next few weeks, Emily's life became a whirlwind of doctor's appointments, nutrition plans, and sleepless nights spent researching high-order multiple pregnancies. Each passing day brought new challenges: severe morning sickness, overwhelming fatigue, and a belly that seemed to grow at an alarming rate. She felt like her body was no longer her own, a vessel stretched to its limits. Her friends tried to offer support, but their well-meaning advice only served to remind her of how unprepared she was. Financial worries loomed large, and she couldn't shake the gnawing fear that something might go wrong. One evening, as she sat on the couch cradling her increasingly heavy belly, she felt it, a fluttering movement, faint at first but unmistakable. Her heart leaped as the sensation grew stronger, more insistent. She placed her hand on her abdomen, tears streaming down her face. "They're real," she whispered to herself. "All 9 of them." The realization was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. These tiny lives, growing inside her, were depending on her strength. She didn't know how, but she would find a way to protect them. But just as she began to find a fragile sense of determination, complications arose. At her next appointment, Dr. Hayes delivered more sobering news. Yeah, Emily, your blood pressure is rising and there are early signs of preeclampsia, he said, his expression grave. This is a serious condition, especially with a pregnancy like yours. You'll need to be hospitalized for closer monitoring. Emily's heart sank. Hospitalized? For how long? Until the babies are delivered, he replied. It's the safest option for everyone. The thought of being confined to a hospital bed for months was unbearable, but she knew there was no choice. She packed her bags and checked into the maternity ward, where her world shrank to a small, sterile room filled with monitors and IV drips. Days turned into weeks, each one a test of her endurance. The medical staff became her lifeline, and she found herself leaning on Dr. Hayes more than she expected. His steady presence and quiet encouragement were a source of comfort in her darkest moments. And then, one night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, the door to her room opened. She turned her head, expecting to see a nurse, but her heart froze when she saw who it was. Ryan. Emily's breath caught in her throat as Ryan stepped into the room. He looked the same, disheveled dark hair, sharp jawline, and that same easy swagger. But there was something different about him now. Maybe it was the guilt etched into his features or the hesitation in his steps as he approached her bed. "What are you doing here?" Emily asked, her voice low but steady. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, as if shielding the babies from his presence. Ryan stopped a few feet away, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I heard about the babies," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. 9 of them. Emily's eyes narrowed. "And that's what brought you back? Curiosity? Because you didn't seem interested when it was just one." He winced at her words, but she didn't care. Anger bubbled up inside her, overtaking the fear and uncertainty she'd been carrying for weeks. "Look, I know I screwed up," Ryan began, running a hand through his hair. "But I want to make things right. I want to help." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Help? How exactly do you plan to do that, Ryan? Are you going to magically erase the months I've spent terrified and alone? Or maybe you'll pay for the mountain of medical bills piling up because of this high-risk pregnancy? You don't just get to walk back in and play hero." Ryan flinched but didn't back down. "I deserve that," he said quietly. "But I'm serious, Emily. I want to be here for you, for the babies. Please just give me a chance." Before she could respond, the door opened again, and Dr. Hayes stepped in. His gaze flicked between Emily and Ryan, and a subtle tension filled the room. Dr. Hayes's presence was calm but commanding, and Ryan immediately seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. "Everything all right in here?" Dr. Hayes asked, his tone neutral but with a protective edge that didn't go unnoticed by Emily. "Yes," she said quickly, though her hands were still gripping the blanket tightly. "This is Ryan, the baby's father." Dr. Hayes nodded politely, his expression unreadable. "Nice to meet you," he said, though there was no warmth in his tone. Turning his attention back to Emily, he continued, "I came to check on how you're feeling tonight. Any more discomfort or swelling?" Emily shook her head. "No, just the usual." "Good," he said. "Your latest labs came back stable, but we'll keep monitoring closely. Rest is still your top priority." As Dr. Hayes spoke, Ryan shifted uncomfortably, clearly feeling out of place. When the doctor finished, Ryan cleared his throat. "Can I talk to Emily alone?" he asked, glancing at her for approval. Dr. Hayes hesitated, his gaze lingering on Emily. She nodded reluctantly, and he gave a curt nod in return. "Call the nurse if you need anything," he said, before stepping out. As soon as the door closed, Ryan sat down in the chair beside her bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Who's that guy?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and irritation. "None of your business," Emily shot back, folding her arms across her chest. "Now, what do you really want, Ryan? Because I don't have the energy for games." He sighed, dragging a hand down his face. "I don't blame you for being angry," he said. But I've been doing a lot of thinking since I left. I was scared, okay? The idea of becoming a father, especially so young, freaked me out. But walking away was the biggest mistake I've ever made. Emily shook her head, her throat tightening. It's not just about you being scared, Ryan. It's about me being left to deal with everything alone. Do you even know what it's like to lie awake every night, wondering if your babies are going to survive? Wondering if I'm going to survive? Ryan's face fell, and for a moment, he looked genuinely remorseful. You're right, he said quietly. I can't undo what I did, but I want to be here now. I want to be a father to our kids. Please, Emily, let me prove it to you. She stared at him, torn between the anger that still burned in her chest and the small, fragile part of her that wanted to believe he could change. But trust wasn't something she could give so easily anymore, not after everything she'd been through. I don't know if I can trust you, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You left me when I needed you the most. How do I know you won't do it again? I'm not going anywhere, he said firmly. Not this time. Before Emily could respond, the babies stirred again, a strong and unmistakable movement that made her gasp. She placed a hand on her belly, her eyes widening. Ryan noticed and leaned closer. Are they? He began, his voice tinged with awe. They're moving, Emily said softly, her hand trembling. It's like they can feel everything. Ryan hesitated for a moment before reaching out, silently asking for permission. Emily hesitated but eventually nodded, and he placed his hand gently on her belly. A small kick met his palm, and his eyes widened in wonder. Wow, he whispered. They're really in there. The moment was fleeting but profound, a brief reminder of the bond they shared despite everything. But as the weight of their situation settled back over them, Emily pulled away, her defenses rising once more. This doesn't change anything, she said firmly. If you want to be in their lives, you'll have to prove it. And that starts with showing up, not just for me, but for them. Ryan nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. I will. I promise. As he left the room, Emily leaned back against the pillows, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. She didn't know if she could trust Ryan, but one thing was certain. Her life was about to get even more complicated. When Dr. Hayes returned a few minutes later, he found her staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. Everything all right? He asked, his tone softer now that they were alone. Emily glanced at him, her heart easing just a little at the sight of his steady presence. It's a lot, she admitted, but I'll get through it. You will, he said, his voice full of quiet conviction. And you won't have to do it alone. A few weeks had passed since Ryan's sudden reappearance, and Emily still wasn't sure how she felt about him being back in her life. He had started showing up for appointments, bringing her small comforts like her favorite snacks, and even talking about preparing for the baby's arrival. Yet, a part of her couldn't shake the nagging doubt. Could she really trust him? Or was this all a performance, a temporary burst of guilt disguised as commitment? Emily's best friend Claire had been vocal about her skepticism from the start. I'm telling you, Em, Claire said one evening as she sat by Emily's hospital bed. A guy like Ryan doesn't just flip a switch and become Father of the Year. People don't change that easily. I know, Emily said with a sigh, absent-mindedly rubbing her belly. But what if he's serious? What if this is his way of making things right? Claire raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. And what if it's not? What if he's just sticking around long enough to make himself feel better? You deserve better than that. Emily didn't have an answer. The truth was, she didn't know what to believe. All she could do was hope that Ryan's actions would match his words. But a few days later, Claire's warnings took on a whole new weight. It happened on a quiet Friday evening. Emily was resting in her hospital bed, flipping through a parenting book, when Claire burst into the room, her face flushed with anger. Claire, Emily said, startled by her friend's sudden entrance. What's going on? Claire hesitated, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Emily, you need to know something. I wasn't going to tell you, but you deserve the truth. Emily's heart began to race. What are you talking about? It's Ryan, Claire said, her voice tight. I saw him tonight. He was at that new bar downtown with another woman. They were all over each other, Em. It wasn't just friendly. The words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Are you sure? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Claire nodded, her expression filled with both anger and sympathy. I'm sure. I even took a picture because I knew you'd need proof. She pulled out her phone and handed it to Emily. There, on the screen, was a grainy but unmistakable photo of Ryan sitting in a dimly lit booth, his arm draped casually around a blonde woman. They were laughing, their heads close together, and it was clear from their body language that this was no innocent meeting. Emily stared at the photo, her stomach churning with a mix of anger and heartbreak. How could he? After everything they'd been through, after all his promises, how could he betray her like this? Tears welled in her eyes and she quickly wiped them away, refusing to let them fall. I can't believe this, she said, her voice shaking. He said he wanted to prove himself. He said he wanted to be a father to these babies. Claire sat down beside her, placing a comforting hand on her arm. I'm so sorry, Em. I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but you needed to know. You deserve the truth. Emily nodded, swallowing hard as she tried to compose herself. Thank you, she said softly. I'm glad you told me. But inside, she was seething. She had given Ryan a chance he didn't deserve, and he had thrown it away. She couldn't let him get away with this, not this time. That night, Emily barely slept. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness, and a deep, aching disappointment. But by the time the sun rose, her sadness had hardened into resolve. She wasn't going to let Ryan waltz in and out of her life whenever it suited him. She wasn't going to let him hurt her again. Later that day, Ryan showed up at the hospital, a bouquet of flowers in hand and a sheepish smile on his face. Hey, Em, he said, leaning down to kiss her cheek. How are you feeling today? Emily pulled back, her eyes cold as she stared up at him. Save it, Ryan, she said, her voice icy. I know. His smile faltered. Know what? About last night, she snapped. About the woman at the bar. Ryan froze, his face going pale. Emily, Don't you dare lie to me, she interrupted, her voice rising. Claire saw you. She has pictures, Ryan, so don't even try to deny it. He opened his mouth to speak but quickly shut it again, guilt flashing across his face. It wasn't what it looked like, he finally said, his tone defensive. She's just a friend. A friend? Emily scoffed. Is that what you're calling it now? Because it sure didn't look like friendship to me. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I made a mistake, okay? I was stressed, and I wasn't thinking straight. But it didn't mean anything. It didn't mean anything? Emily repeated, her voice trembling with anger. You promised me, Ryan. You said you wanted to prove yourself. You said you were serious about being here for me and these babies. And then you go and pull this? I messed up, he said, his voice softer now. But I'm still here, Em. I still want to be here. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I can't do this, Ryan. I can't keep letting you hurt me. I've been through enough, and I won't let you drag me down anymore. Ryan stepped closer, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. Emily, please. Leave, she said firmly, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Just leave. For a moment, Ryan hesitated, his eyes searching hers for any sign of forgiveness. But when he found none, he nodded slowly and turned to leave, the door closing softly behind him. As soon as he was gone, Emily let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with the weight of everything she had been holding in. Claire, who had been waiting just outside the door, rushed in and wrapped her arms around her. You did the right thing, Claire said softly. You're stronger than you think, Em. Emily nodded, resting her head on her friend's shoulder. She didn't feel strong, but she knew she couldn't let Ryan's betrayal define her. She had 9 lives depending on her, and she wasn't about to let them down. The days following Ryan's betrayal were a blur of emotions for Emily. Anger, sadness, and exhaustion swirled together, but through it all, A quiet determination began to grow. She didn't need Ryan to make it through this pregnancy. She had Claire, the dedicated nurses, and, though she hadn't realized how much until now, Dr. Lucas Hayes. Dr. Hayes had always been professional, kind, and attentive, but lately, Emily noticed a subtle warmth in his interactions with her. He never overstepped, but there was something in the way he lingered in her room longer than necessary. The way his reassuring words seemed more personal, and the way his eyes softened when he looked at her swollen belly. One afternoon, as the sunlight streamed through the hospital room's window, Dr. Hayes stopped by for his daily check-in. Emily was seated in her bed reading when he walked in with his clipboard in hand and his usual calm demeanor. "How are we feeling today?" he asked, his voice soothing as he approached her bedside. Emily set the book down and managed a small smile. "Tired, but I guess that's to be expected when you're carrying a small army." Dr. Hayes chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "A small army indeed," he said, glancing at her chart. "Your vitals are stable, which is a good sign. But I'm more interested in how you're holding up, Emily." The genuine concern in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "I'm managing," she said finally, her voice quieter. "Some days are harder than others." He nodded, pulling a chair closer to her bed and sitting down. "That's understandable. You're going through something incredibly challenging, and it's okay to admit when it feels overwhelming." Emily hesitated, then decided to open up. "It's been hard," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Ryan, he's not who I thought he was, and I feel so stupid for believing he could change." Dr. Hayes's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "You're not stupid, Emily. You gave him a chance because you wanted to believe the best in him. That's not a weakness, it's a strength. But it's also okay to set boundaries and protect yourself." His words, spoken with such quiet conviction, brought tears to her eyes. "It just feels so unfair," she said, wiping her cheeks. "These babies deserve so much more than this." "They already have more than you realize," Dr. Hayes said gently. "They have a mother who's strong, resilient, and willing to do whatever it takes to give them the best life possible. That's more than a lot of children get." Emily looked at him, her heart swelling at his words. "Thank you," she said softly. "You've been so kind to me, and I don't even know how to begin to repay you." "You don't have to," he replied, his voice warm. "I'm just doing my job." But it didn't feel like just a job to Emily. There was something in the way he looked at her, something unspoken yet undeniable, that made her feel seen and valued in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew. Dr. Hayes began stopping by more frequently, sometimes just to check in or share a lighthearted story to make her laugh. He brought her books from the hospital library, recommended movies for her to stream, and even started sneaking her little treats like chocolate bars when the nurses weren't looking. One evening, after a particularly long day of monitoring and tests, Emily was feeling especially drained. Dr. Hayes appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of tea. "I figured you could use a pick-me-up," he said, walking over and handing her one of the cups. Emily smiled, the gesture warming her more than the tea. "You're too good to me," she said, taking a sip. He sat down beside her bed, his gaze steady but soft. "You deserve it," he said simply. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the faint beeping of the monitors and the distant chatter of nurses in the hallway. Emily found herself studying him, the way his hair fell slightly out of place, the way his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, the way his presence made her feel safe. "Can I ask you something?" she said, breaking the silence. "Of course," he replied, setting his cup down on the bedside table. "Why did you become a doctor?" she asked. "I mean, you're so good at what you do, but I feel like there's more to it than just a career choice." Dr. Hayes smiled, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "It's a bit cliché," he admitted, "but I've always wanted to help people. My mom was a single mother like you, and I saw how hard she worked to take care of me. She was my hero. I guess, in a way, I wanted to give back, to be someone people could rely on when they needed it most." Emily's heart softened at his words. "She must be so proud of you," She was, he said quietly, his gaze dropping to his hands. She passed away a few years ago. Oh, Emily said, her chest tightening. I'm so sorry. He shook his head, offering her a small smile. Thank you. She lived a good life, and I try to honor her memory by being the best doctor I can be. Emily reached out, placing a hand on his. You're doing an amazing job, she said sincerely. You've been my rock through all of this, and I don't know how I would have gotten this far without you. Dr. Hayes looked at her, his eyes searching hers, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to shift. His hand lingered under hers, warm and steady, and Emily felt a flutter in her chest, one that had nothing to do with the babies. Thank you, Emily, he said softly. That means more to me than you know. The morning of Emily's delivery began in chaos. She woke to sharp, rhythmic pains coursing through her abdomen, stronger and more insistent than anything she'd felt before. Her heart raced as she pressed the call button for the nurse, gripping the edge of the hospital bed as another contraction tore through her. Within minutes, her room was filled with a flurry of activity. Nurses bustled around, checking her vitals, adjusting the monitors strapped to her belly, and prepping her for the operating room. The air was thick with tension, and Emily could barely focus on their voices over the roaring in her ears. It's time, one of the nurses said gently, placing a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder. The babies are ready. Emily's mind swirled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had known this day would come, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer enormity of it. 9 babies. 9 tiny lives depending on her. As the nurses wheeled her toward the operating room, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. Emily! Dr. Hayes's voice was calm yet urgent as he jogged down the hallway to catch up with the gurney. His presence immediately steadied her, and she felt a rush of relief as he reached her side. I'm here, he said, giving her hand a firm squeeze. We're going to take care of you and the babies. You're in the best hands. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm scared, she whispered, her voice trembling. I know, he said, his tone gentle but resolute. But you're stronger than you think, and we're going to get through this together. Just focus on breathing, okay? The operating room was brightly lit and buzzing with activity when they arrived. Emily was transferred to the surgical table, her body trembling as the medical team worked swiftly around her. Dr. Hayes stayed by her side, his hand never leaving hers. This is going to be a cesarean delivery, he explained, his voice steady despite the controlled chaos around them. You're going to feel some pressure, but no pain. Just keep breathing and focus on staying calm. Emily nodded, trying to steady her breathing as the anesthesiologist administered the epidural. Her lower body quickly went numb, and a sterile drape was placed across her abdomen, blocking her view of the procedure. She closed her eyes, clutching Dr. Hayes's hand like a lifeline. The next moments felt both endless and instantaneous. She could feel the tugging and pressure as the surgeons worked, and her heart pounded as she waited for the first sound. The sound that would tell her everything was okay. Then it happened. A tiny, piercing cry filled the room, followed by another and another. Emily's eyes flew open, tears streaming down her face as she turned to Dr. Hayes, who was beaming. That's 3 so far, he said, his voice filled with awe. They're beautiful, Emily. One by one, the babies were delivered, each announced with a cry that sent a wave of relief crashing over her. Nurses and neonatologists worked swiftly to assess each baby, ensuring they were stable before moving them to the NICU. Despite the overwhelming exhaustion and the haze of the moment, Emily felt an indescribable mix of joy and wonder with every new life brought into the world. 8, and here's number 9, Dr. Hayes said, his voice thick with emotion as the final baby let out a healthy wail. He glanced down at Emily, his eyes shining. You did it. Emily let out a shaky laugh, her tears flowing freely now. I can't believe it, she whispered. They're all here, all 9 of them. As the medical team worked to stabilize her and finish the procedure, Dr. Hayes stayed by her side, his hand still holding hers. You were incredible, he said softly, his gaze steady. Those babies are lucky to have you. No, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'm lucky to have them. And to have you. Thank you, Lucas, for everything. His expression softened, and for a moment, it felt as though the rest of the room had fallen away. Always, he said simply. The hours that followed were a blur of medical updates, paperwork, and cautious introductions to her babies. Each one was impossibly tiny but perfect in their own way, their fragile forms wrapped in soft blankets as they lay in incubators in the NICU. Emily couldn't hold them yet, but she touched each one gently, marveling at their tiny fingers and toes. By the time the evening came, exhaustion had overtaken her, but she couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed the events of the day, the cries of her newborns, and the steady presence of Dr. Hayes through it all. He had been her rock, her anchor in the storm, and she couldn't ignore the growing feelings stirring in her heart. A knock at the door broke her thoughts, and she looked up to see Dr. Hayes standing in the doorway, a soft smile on his face. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Of course," she said, sitting up slightly as he entered. "I just wanted to check on you," he said, pulling a chair up to her bedside. "How are you feeling?" "Exhausted," she admitted, "but happy. Overwhelmed, but grateful." He nodded, his gaze warm. "You should be proud of yourself, Emily. What you did today was nothing short of extraordinary." "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice soft. "You've been more than just my doctor, Lucas. You've been my friend, and my support system. I don't even have the words to thank you." "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice equally soft. "It's been my privilege to be here for you." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with unspoken emotions. Emily searched his face, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what she was feeling. "Lucas," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done without you. You've become so important to me." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, the professional mask he always wore seemed to slip. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you're more important to me than you realize." 2 years later, Emily's life had transformed into something she could never have imagined during those chaotic days in the hospital. Her 9 children, affectionately nicknamed the Jenkins Squad by her friends, were thriving, albeit with the occasional whirlwind of toddler chaos that came with having so many little ones. Thanks to a village of support that included her best friend Claire, Dr. Lucas Hayes, now her boyfriend of nearly a year, and a network of friends, Emily had found her footing as a single mother of multiples. Emily had also landed a great job as a project coordinator at a nonprofit organization, working flexible hours that allowed her to juggle her demanding home life. The weight of financial stress had eased, and for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. Her relationship with Lucas was steady and filled with the kind of quiet joy she hadn't known she needed. He was everything Ryan hadn't been: attentive, dependable, and genuinely in love with both her and the children. Life wasn't perfect. It was messy, exhausting, and often overwhelming, but it was hers. And she was proud of the life she had built. That pride was what made the unannounced knock on her front door one crisp autumn evening so jarring. Emily was in the living room, corralling 2 of the toddlers while Claire entertained another 3 at the kitchen table with crayons and coloring books. The other 4 were upstairs with Lucas, who was reading them a bedtime story. The knock interrupted the gentle hum of household noise, and Emily frowned as she moved to answer it. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Ryan. He stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, his trademark smirk firmly in place. He looked exactly as she remembered him, cocky and careless, with that same air of arrogance that had once charmed her and now made her stomach churn. "Emily," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Long time, no see?" She stared at him, her mind racing. "What are you doing here, Ryan?" "Nice to see you too," he said with a laugh. "I was in town and thought I'd drop by. See how my kids are doing." His words sent a surge of anger through her. "Your kids?" she repeated, her voice cold. "You walked out on them before they were even born. You don't get to show up 2 years later and act like you care." Ryan shrugged, unbothered by her tone. "I've had some time to think," he said. I made mistakes, sure, but I want to make up for it. I want to be part of their lives. Emily crossed her arms over her chest, narrowing her eyes at him. You're 2 years too late, Ryan. They don't even know who you are. And frankly, I don't think they need to. He feigned a hurt expression, but there was a glint of amusement in his eyes that made her blood boil. Come on, Em, he said smoothly. Don't be like that. I'm their father. I have a right to see them. You had that right, she snapped, and you threw it away. You don't get to waltz in here and disrupt their lives just because you suddenly feel like playing dad. Before Ryan could respond, Lucas appeared in the hallway, carrying one of the toddlers in his arms. His expression darkened the moment he saw Ryan, and he stepped protectively beside Emily. Everything all right here? Lucas asked, his voice calm but firm. Ryan's eyes flicked to Lucas, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Ah, so this is the good doctor, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. I've heard about you. Playing house with my kids, huh? Lucas's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. Emily's done an incredible job raising those kids without you, he said evenly. If you're here to cause trouble, you can leave. Now. Ryan laughed, shaking his head. Wow, protective, aren't we? I'm not here to fight, Doc. I just want to see my kids. They're my kids, Emily interjected, her voice firm. You've never even met them, Ryan. You don't get to just show up and disrupt their lives because it suits you. Ryan's smirk faltered for a moment, and a flash of something darker crossed his face. You can't keep them from me, he said, his tone hardening. I'm their father, whether you like it or not. Biology doesn't make you a father, Lucas said quietly, shifting the toddler in his arms. Being there for them does, and you haven't been. The tension in the air was thick, and Emily could feel her hands trembling as she gripped the doorframe. She had worked too hard to build this life, to create a stable, loving environment for her children. She wasn't about to let Ryan tear it apart. If you want to be in their lives, she said finally, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface, you'll need to prove it. And that starts with going through the legal system. No more showing up unannounced. No more empty promises. If you're serious, get a lawyer and file for visitation. Until then, stay away. Ryan stared at her, his expression unreadable. Fine, he said after a long moment. If that's what it takes. Without another word, he turned and walked down the porch steps, disappearing into the evening shadows. Emily watched him go, her heart pounding as she closed the door and leaned against it. Lucas placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You handled that perfectly, he said softly. I'm proud of you. Emily nodded, her eyes welling with tears. I can't let him ruin everything. Not again. You won't, Lucas assured her. We've got your back, Emily. You're not alone in this. As Claire appeared in the hallway, looking concerned but ready to jump in if needed, Emily felt a surge of gratitude for the people who had become her family. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, Ryan included. Over the next few months, Ryan's unwelcome reappearance cast a shadow over Emily's otherwise steady life. True to his word, or perhaps out of spite, he filed for legal visitation rights. The news rattled Emily at first, the thought of him disrupting the peaceful, stable home she had built for her children filling her with dread. But with Lucas by her side, Claire's unwavering support, and a good lawyer, she faced the challenge head-on. The court proceedings were tense and draining, but they ultimately worked in Emily's favor. Ryan's lack of involvement, paired with his inability to prove he could provide a safe, stable environment, led the court to grant him only limited, supervised visitation. It wasn't the complete victory Emily had hoped for, but it was enough to protect her children while giving Ryan the opportunity to prove whether or not he truly cared. Despite the legal drama, Emily's life continued to flourish. Her children were growing rapidly, each one developing their own unique personality. Mealtime was a boisterous affair, with toddlers clamoring for attention and food, and the house was filled with laughter, chaos, and the occasional tantrum. It was exhausting, but it was the kind of exhaustion that came with a full heart. Lucas became an even more integral part of their lives, seamlessly blending into their family dynamic. He had a knack for soothing the kids when they were cranky, and his patience seemed limitless, a trait that Emily cherished more with each passing day. He was there for every milestone, from first steps to first words, and Emily couldn't imagine a better partner to share the journey with. One crisp spring evening, as the kids played in the backyard under Claire's watchful eye, Lucas took Emily by the hand and led her to the porch swing. She smiled at him, leaning into his side as they rocked gently back and forth. "You've been amazing through all of this," Lucas said, his voice low. "With Ryan, the kids, everything. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met." Emily laughed softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "I don't feel strong most of the time," she admitted. "But I just keep going because I don't have a choice. The kids need me." "They do," he agreed. "But so do I." Emily lifted her head to look at him, her heart skipping a beat at the intensity in his eyes. "Lucas," she began, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "Let me say this," he said, reaching into his pocket. Emily's breath hitched as he pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a simple but stunning diamond ring. "Emily Jenkins," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You have shown me what love truly looks like. You've shown me resilience, kindness, and a strength I can only hope to match. I love you, and I love those kids with everything I have. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Emily's eyes as she stared at him, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, Lucas, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she flung her arms around his neck, laughing through her tears as he held her close. The kids, sensing something exciting had happened, ran over to the porch, their laughter and cheers filling the air as they clambered onto their mother and Lucas. The months that followed were a whirlwind of wedding preparations and blending their lives even further. Emily and Lucas tied the knot in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by friends, family, and, of course, the children. It wasn't a fairy tale wedding, but it was perfect, a celebration of love, resilience, and the family they had created together. As time passed, Ryan's visits became infrequent. While he initially tried to play the part of a devoted father, his lack of consistency soon became apparent. Emily stopped waiting for him to step up and instead focused on the people who truly mattered, the ones who showed up every single day. Years later, as Emily and Lucas sat on their porch, watching their now school-aged children play in the yard, she reflected on how far they had come. Her life was far from what she had imagined it would be. But it was better, fuller, than she could have ever dreamed. "Thank you," she said suddenly, turning to Lucas with a soft smile. "For what?" he asked, lacing his fingers through hers. "For being here. For loving me. For loving them." Lucas leaned over and kissed her forehead. "Always," he said simply. And as Emily watched her children laugh and play under the golden glow of the setting sun, she knew she had found her happily ever after. Not in perfection, but in the beautiful, messy, and joy-filled life she had built with the people she loved.